Hi, welcome to the Great War. This is the lesson for the Great War, the lesson which numerically, if you were following the years, is supposed to start the course. The Great War lasts from 1914 to 1918. It is up until the time that it occurs the bloodiest war in human history, the most vast and most disastrous conflict ever to befall humankind. Of course, it ends in 1918, and we can't forget, what begins in 1939, only 21 years later, which is the start of an even worse war. So today we're going to talk about the Great War, and we're going to look at the Great War as it is a event in global history, certainly. We're going to look at specifically from the European context. And we're going to specifically look at not only, we're going to look at here's a brief outline. We're going to look at the causes of the war. Why does the war occur? What are the not the long range causes that we discussed earlier, nationalism, colonialism, industrialization, but now we're going to look more at those geopolitical causes on what is generally referred to as the European continent. Um, those those particular situations, those particular alliances, a lot of the granularity of that information you can read in the text, but we're going to review some of the major points here, certainly. Then we're going to look at also, we're going to look at technologies of the war. We're going to look at some of the technologies which are still with us today and which made the war, in many ways, a very large surprise for those who were engaging in it. Those who were caught in the midst of battle, and even those who were employing and inventing these technologies, really did not understand or did not grasp fully, did not really grasp at all in 1914 the the immense changes in warfare that would occur as a result of their development. Many of these technologies and many of these, mostly in the form of weaponry and but not only in terms of communications, etc. Many of these had been stockpiled before the war, and they all came together almost like some disastrous, diabolical puzzle in the war and conspired to make it one of the worst wars in human history. Technology had a lot to do with it. We're also going to look at some strategies and realities of how the war plays out. We'll look at some philosophical perspectives, and at the end, we'll look at legacies of the war. So let's just launch right into it. I'm going to start. Here's a map that shows the before and after of Europe. This shows you this is 1914, prior to the war, and then as you see on the right, you have 1918. Some changes that you should take note of, especially because a lot of the geopolitical considerations that go into the different sides of the war are still going to be present after the war and are actually going to really set the stage for um, World War II. So it's important to understand some of the geography of it before we go into World War One, because a lot of the concerns of some of the powers are replicated once we get to World War II, and the sides change to a certain extent, but in some senses they also stay very much the same. As you have here, these central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later Bulgaria, and also Turkey down here. We'll get to how all these are formed. Um, this Central European center is hemmed in, or feels itself hemmed in, specifically, also very much so in the case of Germany, between France to the west and to a lesser extent Great Britain and Russia to the east. And this is going to govern a lot of Germany's political thinking and a lot of their activity and actions and strategies during the war, um, especially as the war starts out. If you look here in the 1918 context, look at what has happened, especially to Austria-Hungary. Germany has shrunken considerably. Here in the east is a buffer state, of Poland between Germany and Russia. This is created certainly for the benefit of Poles who wanted their own nation state, but it's also acquiesced to by the powers that win the war because they want this buffer state between Germany and Russia, so they do not fight, or they do not come as close to full scale battle. Notice these states that emerge: Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary, the core states of the original Austria-Hungary, are now two rather small, significant, but nonetheless small Central European powers. You have the state of Czechoslovakia today that is split into two, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, and to the east. You have this large Balkan conglomeration called Yugoslavia, which will have a pivotal history going through both World War II and then afterwards all the way into the late 90s, when Yugoslavia will disintegrate into a lot of its constituent Balkan states of the pre-World War I context. And so pay attention to these particular states. Pay attention also to Italy. Italy's an interesting case because Italy, beginning in the 1880s, is actually allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But Italy's always a little nervous about this area right here near the Adriatic. Italy desires a lot of this area. So does Austria-Hungary. So this is a tenuous alliance. So early on, Italy is allied with them, not during the war, but Italy later joins the Triple Entente, later joins the Allied powers in 1915. Of course, Italy then will be the power that will also join the Axis in World War II. So because they have some common Central European concerns in relation to the Allied powers in World War II. Because the Allied powers in World War II, again, look what you have. You have the Allied powers in World War I: United Kingdom, France, and Russia. World War II: United Kingdom, France, and Russia. So a lot of these sides replicate in World War II, with some exceptions, and certainly a lot of what's going to spur on the war is this collection of Balkan states down here. They are going to be formed from what is really the disintegration of what is nicknamed often the sick man of Europe, or the Ottoman Empire. So I'm going to start actually talking about the Ottoman Empire. This is an important concept to understand, not only because the Ottoman Empire's disintegration really sets the brush fire. People often talk about a spark that ignites World War I, but this really is the start of the brush fire that results in the conflagration that is World War I, this disintegration down here. But also because the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in a larger sense is going to have profound implications for the post-World War II situation in the Middle East and in North Africa. So when we get to discuss that in Europe's relation to the Middle East and North Africa and the territories of the former Ottoman Empire, it's important to have some context for that at the beginning. So I'll start with both of those now. So we'll start with the Ottoman Empire. I'll skip that. I'll skip that too. Here's the Islamic world in 1500. I could go all the way back to the creation of the Islamic Caliphate and the enormous span of the expansion of Islam after the death of Muhammad in 632. This is a story which is just absolutely fascinating, and if you ever get the chance to take a course in the origins of Islamic civilization, I urge you to do it. It is an absolutely fascinating story about the rapidity and strength of this massive empire, which really was really the seat of a great deal of scientific and humanistic learning, during the time when Europe had essentially collapsed into warring to a series of warlords. So this is a fascinating story in itself. But let's really begin the story in 1500, when there's four main Islamic empires on Earth. Remember, 1500 is coincidental with the time that Europe is just beginning to cross the Atlantic. Columbus, 1492, just beginning to cross the Atlantic in searching for new routes, primarily around the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire controls these trade routes that go east. And so these emerging European kingdoms are looking this way to both around the Horn of Africa down here, and also looking east for some new route. So here's the Ottoman Empire, though. We'll concentrate on this. Vast swath of the Earth's surface is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. It's a very powerful empire, and it is really, in a sense, threatening many of these emerging European states, and was seen as a dire threat to certainly Central Europe here. So notice the extent of the Ottoman Empire in 1500 here in what is going to be the Balkans. This is where World War I will really begin. Talking about the Ottoman Empire, we can't help but be amazed by its size and its strength and its longevity. It lasts for the better part of 600 years. It really ends essentially at the end of World War I. And so when we start this course, we often talk about the Ottoman Empire and say it's the sick man of Europe and it's disintegrating. But often when it's taught, the larger history of the Ottoman Empire is not included with it. And I think that's kind of important to go into, because it's often left out of a lot of other stories too. The Ottoman Empire was always centered around what we would call modern-day Turkey, around Asia Minor, around that particular area. That was always sort of the geopolitical center of power from which the power emanated into the North Africa and beyond. In 1500, the three most powerful empires on Earth would have to be considered the Ottoman Empire, the Ming Dynasty in China, and the Inca in Peru. It gives you a sense of the completely different context of the world in 1500. We often think of European history, oh, Spain was powerful. And no, they actually weren't. They were actually terribly weak at that time. 1453, Constantinople, which had been the seat of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the sort of capital, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, by 1453, it had been almost completely hemmed in by the Ottoman Empire, completely sort of surrounded. And then in 1453, Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, and then, of course, was renamed Istanbul. Afterwards, there was huge expansion afterwards across North Africa and even all the way into Central Europe. By 1529, the Ottoman Empire had reached. There was an attempted invasion of Vienna, but this was actually pushed back. Vienna never fell to the Ottomans, and so that part of Central Europe, all of that up until that, was affected by this controlled by this Islamic empire. There was a lot of pressure. Here's a map that shows a sort of expansion of these of the Ottoman Empire from 1300, where it starts out in this area. Notice how close Constantinople is to all of this development. So between 1300 and 1453, this empire grows up around the city of Constantinople, which is still nominally controlled by Christians of the Byzantine Empire. And then you see quickly after the fall of Constantinople, this rapid spread to 1683 all throughout, and sort of gives you the sense of the height of the Ottoman Empire by the end of the 17th century. Well, and here's a depiction of the storming of the walls of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453. So the Ottomans in the East were always seen as a sort of lurking threat to Europe. This rivalry and also years and years of cooperation and trade. But this rivalry between the Ottomans and these powers in Europe, and certainly as Europe um, gets more and more powerful through the transatlantic trade, through the transatlantic slave trade, and through the colonies in North and South America, the power of Europe rises in relation to the Ottoman Empire. And what we'll see at the beginning of this lesson on the Great War, we'll see the final disintegration of the last bits of this empire. Here is a map depicting between 1860 and 1923, sort of the formation of Turkey, really from the sort of the core of what was the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire kind of disintegrates, all of its constituents disintegrate into the core of Turkey and modern day Turkey. So here you have shows you the dates where you can see when each of these fell. Notice how many of these bits fall in the midst, really, of World War, right prior to World War I and after. This entire area sort of collapses during the course of World War I. So, and then even afterwards, there is some collapse. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Up until 1914, what the history of the Ottoman Empire is in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, seeing Europe industrializing, pretty much realizes that they either have to keep up or they're going to be subject to absorption by these growing European powers. They fear, to an extent, being colonized by them. There's a period in the 19th century called Tanzimat where the Ottoman Empire begins to modernize, where they modernize both industrially. They start to create factories. They start to establish some form of industrial system. They liberalize a lot of their social policies, really in line with how democratization and liberalization in Europe in general was proceeding at that time. Professionalization of not only the military but professionalization in all walks of life occurred. But there's also, throughout the Ottoman Empire, as the Ottoman Empire is almost desperately trying to modernize and make itself in many ways, to a certain extent, in the image of these European powers, there is rising nationalism throughout the empire. Some examples of this are there happen outside of the core, what we might call the core Turkish context of the Ottoman Empire. The Greek War of Independence in 1821, Greece breaks free from the Ottoman Empire. There's a Russo-Turkish War in 1877 for Russia. Russia is desiring, and we'll talk a lot about Russia in the next lesson, Russia is desiring passage for their navy through the Dardanelles, and this is something which the Ottoman Empire controls. You have the rise of this young Turk movement of conservatives in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, that are seeking to break out and are seeking to establish their own nation state, to restore the grandeur of the older Ottoman Empire. What will happen is that they will, the Ottoman Empire will really collapse into that core, and Turkey will nonetheless be a strong state, but it certainly will not have the far-flung areas that it had control of prior to the sort of long, slow-motion 19th century collapse of the empire. In 1908, a revolution creates a constitutional monarchy, and this emerging Turkey out of the Ottoman Empire creates a secret alliance with Germany against Russia. So now we're going to get into the alliances. Now we're going to move from looking at the states, and we're going to start talking about the different alliances, because it's got to be understood. A lot of it might be terribly confusing. Don't worry if you don't remember every single part of it, but some aspect of it has to be. We have to kind of look at some different. We have to try to understand how all of these states go to war. Here we go. Here we have. I like this little bubble chart. It shows the differing alliances. Here you have here like dates of particular alliances between these different nation states in Europe, and it's informative in a nice pictorial way. Here over here we have the Triple Alliance between Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Germany. This is an earlier Triple Alliance. This will later Italy will later be, but this is the early Triple Alliance. And here you have the Triple Entente of Russia, France, and Britain. And notice what is kind of in the hinterlands here. Here's the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, this disintegrating empire. And as it disintegrates, some of the states which are going to spin off of it in what we call continental Europe are Bulgaria and Serbia. Well, these areas both have their own, as this area of the Ottoman Empire disintegrates, and maybe it's better to look at an actual map here. Um, well, anyway, we'll look at an actual map in a second. As this area in the Balkans disintegrates, you have the rising of a large number of nationalist movements. There are many different peoples that live in the Balkans. Each of them have their own form and desire for their own independent state in a relatively small area. Up until the 20th century, this nationalist fervor had really not occurred as much in the Balkans. Many of the people in the Balkans still associated with their village, associated with their particular region. They were part of the larger Ottoman Empire, but as weak as the Ottoman Empire was, they didn't really think about as much their larger place in that empire and did not consider themselves allied to it. That weakness, in the absence of that control, though, and in threatened by rising European interest in having control over those different areas in the Balkans, you have these little nationalisms kind of exploding one by one. You have these different nationalist movements that are rising. Serbia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Macedonia, all of these, Bulgaria, all of these are rising up and desiring their own independence, while at the same time there is a jockeying for some of that land, not only between those different nationalities, but coming from, to a large extent, from Austria-Hungary. And so we'll see the fight is really going to begin between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. So let's go through, why does the world explode in 1914? And let's go through a larger overview of this. And some of the broad reasons the world is on the brink we've already talked about. We've already talked about militarism and colonialism. We've talked about industrialization, and we've talked about nationalism and the competition between these different emerging European nations who are so powerful. How they are trying to maintain a balance of power even as they're competing against each other, and even as their militaries are getting stronger and stronger. One of the reasons why the world explodes in 1914 is because, well, wars on the European continent are not unusual. England and France had engaged in wars going back hundreds and hundreds of years. This has been a common rivalry. The Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 18th century, Napoleon went all the way essentially to Moscow. So these broad-based wars on the European continent, initiated by one or another state and in attempts to create some sort of larger European empire, were not unusual. Just in 1870 to 71, as we've discussed before, you had the Franco-Prussian War, which was this pretty large-scale war between France and Prussia, the result of which is kind of part and parcel of German unification and German unification at that time. Why is the war so great? Why do we call it the Great War? If there were all these other wars on the European continent before, what's so great about it? Well, this isn't. There's a couple things. One is that this war is one of the first wars in which, after German and Italian unification, after there's this nationalism, this sort of popular nationalism, where most of the people, many of the people in these particular nations, or a large portion of them, feel invested in the nation state. And so this is happening in Germany and Italy. This is a process which had already really occurred a little bit earlier in England and France, and to a certain extent in Russia as well. There's this increasing investment by the people in the military and in power and in nationalism. So the emerging democracy actually creates a situation in which people are more fervent for war, and they elect or approve of leaders who who are going to engage in war. So a paradox is democracy does not actually, to a certain extent, make it more peaceful. In many ways, um, democracy creates this situation in which there's a clamor for war in many of these places. The example of Russia is very interesting, and it's one which we'll go into more in the next lesson. But because Russia is certainly an autocratic state, this causes friction in both England and France about the fact that they're going to be allied with Russia during World War One, and this is frankly an autocratic state. But this is also going to be one of the reasons, because Russia is an autocracy that's engaging in this massive war. Well, Russia does not make it through the war. Because there's not as much popular support, because there is no democracy. There's no popular support really for the conflict in Russia, or at least there's a lack of it. Russia is not able to survive, and actually withdraws from the war in 1917, almost at the same time that the United States enters. That it's not really a coincidence, but that coincidental occurrence, you see the two players that are going to take place in the Cold War: Russia, later Soviet Union, and the United States. Those two powers are going to be instrumental in really the really the entire second half of this course, to a large extent. Also, it's also great because it's not just Europe. This is not another Franco-Prussian war. This is not another Napoleonic war. This is a war post the rapid expansion of European powers into Africa and Asia. We talked about the scramble for Africa and the gobbling up of Africa. So this is a war that not only involves colonial troops from these places, and we'll look at that in a second, but it also involves conflict in those places. Part of the war is an expectation that whoever wins is going to be able to absorb the colonies of the other side. And this actually happens. Germany, for instance, loses all of their African colonies in World War One, and they are quickly taken over by victor states, most prominently the United Kingdom. Another thing that makes it so great is, and then we're going to talk about this to a great extent, is technology. This is the technologies, the new technologies of World War One. It's almost impossible to imagine our world today without them. Many of these were developed to a certain extent shortly before World War One, but they were never really used in battle. We have airplanes. The first time that you have the skies are a locus of death in warfare, as opposed to just artillery being dropped on you. This is new. And this will become the way by which wars will be fought for the rest up until the present day and for the foreseeable future. Machine guns, tanks, poison gas, the weaponry, the strategies, everything changes in World War One, and the real disaster that unfolds is because nobody expects war to change. This is a perennial thing in war. Leaders go into war thinking the war is going to be fought like the last war, and the war is just a completely different thing than what they expected. Another reason why the world explodes is this balance of power between these two sides, which you saw in the last kind of bubble. You have each side is in one way preparing for war. They believe that war is inevitable, but at the same time, they don't really want to get into it. They don't really want to take that extra step. They don't want to, because once it happens, they know that um, it's either going to have to be fought very quick and has to be over very fast, but they know that something's coming. They but at the same time they believe that it's going to be very short. But they need to balance their particular power against each other to make sure that they won't be caught unawares when that war comes. And so this process of this balance had really been going on for about 30 years, where each of the nations is kind of paranoidally looking to their left and right, and militarizing and calculating and waiting and seeing if something's going to fall apart. And by the time we get to 1914, it's so precarious, the situation, that almost anything, including the assassination of just one person, ends up triggering a series of dominoes, which results in the death of tens of millions of people. Another aspect of this that um, can't be discounted is that Germany, in particular, in the center of Europe, is increasingly is the locus by which is the state, is the nation that has to be most concerned about the war starting. And that's because they have to look to Russia to their east and France to their west, and they have to figure out how to fight this two-front war. There had been a plan which had been concocted decades earlier, referred to as the Schlieffen Plan, which essentially said once war breaks out, either Germany was going to have to initiate that war on a moment's notice or react quite quickly, because the plan was attack France, neutralize France by taking over Paris, and then rapidly shift all those troops that had been used in defeating the French army east to fight Russia. And that if that could be done, if that needle could be threaded, that Germany could then expand and defeat both powers on either side. And it was really it's kind of a gauntlet that they had to run in order to do that. And so that Schlieffen Plan was on the books. Essentially, that war plan just stayed there. And then as soon as the Great War occurs, it's activated. And the Schlieffen Plan is important because when we look forward to World War II, why is it that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, for instance, in Germany, developed the Luftwaffe and developed something called Blitzkrieg, lightning warfare? Why do they develop these super fast tanks? Because they want to basically perfect this plan. They need to neutralize France as fast as possible. And in World War II, they do succeed. Wherein in World War I, they don't, and we will see why. So we went over this before, so feel free to fast forward. But we talked about the rise of Germany, powerful nationalistic state created in 1871. It's an autocratic state for the most part, with an energetic but toothless Reichstag. So it's a democracy in name, but it's a very weak democracy. Again, we're going to see that the two nations that fight in World War I that have some of the weakest public support are not going to fare very well. That includes Russia, the Empire of Russia, and Germany. The Germany was kind of driven by the quite eccentric, in many ways, impulsive, generally considered not very bright Kaiser Wilhelm II, who created this kind of militaristic state. His grandmother was Queen Victoria of England, so he had ties to the British Empire, but increasingly made a series of comments prior to the war which angered Britons, whereas if he perhaps had been a more diplomatic individual, um, could have prevented could have prevented the war from occurring the way that it did, and could have increased the chances of success of Germany. But that just wasn't going to be the case. His temperament was not made for diplomacy. Um, the There's a great deal of national pride at the recent unification of Germany. This should be understood. And you also had increasing population, whereas France had a declining population. So you had increasing population. Germany had industrialized incredibly quickly, had become very powerful, had that resulted in a great deal of weaponry, and had resulted in a great deal of economic power that it had not had before. But of course, even in all of this confidence in their new abilities, they had this fear of being surrounded between France and Russia, which was not a idle fear, but they had this fear that that any further expansion was going to be stymied by one or the other. And they had imperial ambitions, as we've seen in German East Africa, and they're also involved in Asia as well. Well, here's the Schlieffen concept, or the Schlieffen plan. And here we can see what Germany's plan is, that once, this was on the books, as soon as a conflict breaks out, what Germany will do is go through the neutral country of Belgium, largely because most here on the actual Franco-German border, this is pretty heavily defended by France. This is where France throws most of its defensive power. Here, along the relatively peaceful border with Belgium, France does not militarize as much, largely because Belgium has its own defenses here. Well, the German plan is to go through the weak state of Belgium. That would, of course, require the invasion of a neutral state, which is certainly not going to win you any friends. But that is the plan. This is almost the exact same thing that the Nazis do in World War II to get to Paris. And again, which they succeed. Now, notice the Schlieffen concept, to sort of swing around, capture this whole area of France, and then send those troops that you don't need after you've consolidated your wins here, and send them back to the east. That is the Schlieffen concept. Well, how does the Great War begin? You have Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy in the Triple Alliance. They, to a certain extent, have agreed on mutual aid with each other, although Italy didn't really. Italy's part of the alliance, but they don't want to commit to necessarily jumping in if either of them is attacked. So Austria, Hungary, and Germany really have the strongest mutual aid pact. So if Austria, Hungary is attacked, Germany will jump in, and vice versa. Similarly, you have the Triple Entente between Great Britain, France, and Russia. And each of them is seeking a balance of power. There are times when it looks like Germany might ally in some way, shape, or form with Great Britain. It looks like there's chances for Germany to ally to a certain extent in some cases with Russia. But this never really materializes, and this kind of central European balance is really what what characterizes this period. And there's this need for a quick war, especially on behalf of Germany. Because remember, if Germany can't take over Paris, they can't fortify their troops in Russia, and then what happens? Well, they don't really have a plan beyond that. And neither does any of Europe. And the lack of a plan beyond thinking that you're going to win the war quickly, the lack of planning for a long-range war is what kills so many people. Every state here is assuming this is going to be quick. Every state needs it to be quick. The prospect of it not being quick is something that none of them can really fathom. And we'll see why they can't fathom it, because even today, looking back at World War I, it's hard to fathom what happened. It's hard to fathom the amount of death and destruction that occurs. Let's go to the Balkans, this former part of the Ottoman Empire, as we discussed before. Notice this area here. Um, what this map shows is competing regions in the Balkans as the Ottoman Empire disintegrates that are absorbed by one or another of these newly nationalizing powers of Serbia and Bulgaria, and then there's Albania, and then there's Greece, which desires part of this part of what, as you can see there, is identified as Macedonia. That's big kind of conflict point today. Actually, what is Macedonia? That's something I won't go into right now. But um, but notice that these areas, which are, this is right, 1913, 1913, 1913, 1913. Something is brewing here in these Balkan wars, which take place in 1913, that is destabilizing the entire region. And here, looming closest to it, here's the Ottoman Empire disintegrating, is the still strong Austria-Hungarian Empire. And they are looking to the south. Well, these powers, Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, Romania here, they are looking to expand their power in this very dynamic region. Well, a lot of the reason why they did that was because in 1908, Austria-Hungary moves into the region and takes over this area of what is today Croatia and Slovenia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And if you remember, there was a pretty terrible war that occurred just in that place in the mid to late 90s. Um, the after effects are still being felt in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, actually, where there's still war criminals from this war still being tried. And so Austria-Hungary seizes this area. This angers Serbia and Russia. Serbia is allied with Russia. Russia sees itself often as the protector of all Slavs. This is largely a Slavic region, and when Serbia desires more territory, desires part of this for Greater Serbia, and Russia backs really Serbia's desires here. They believe they'll have a strong ally there, and if they can have more alliances here in this area, they can control this Black Sea region and even parts of the Aegean Sea, and even this the Straits here. So if they can control that, they can increase their naval power. So they see a lot of advantages to getting involved and making alliances here in this area. Well, what happens? Sarajevo, right here, right where my red dot is. Sarajevo, now part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, as of 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austria-Hungarian throne, goes to visit troops down in Sarajevo. And in just one of these things that's mind-boggling today, rides around in an open-air car, an early automobile, rides around Sarajevo, gets stuck really kind of in an alley. There was an attempted bomb attack on his car earlier. They take a different route. They get stuck in an alley, and there in the alley, quite conveniently, is Gustav Princip, a member of the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist group, kind of a sort of a radical Serbian nationalist group. There are many of them scattered throughout the city that day. He just happened to be in this alley. He takes out his pistol, goes up to the open air car, and assassinates the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne and his young wife. And both of them die bleeding in the car. This is a enormous event in terms of assassinations. There were a lot of assassinations at this time. People being assassinated right and left, not very well protected. A lot of them driving around in open air cars. But this one assassination starts all of the dominoes falling. And we'll see why. A lot of it, while we often have these events where you have this one event which triggers all of these other events, remember that a lot of these powers had been anticipating any event. There was always going to be some event. So sometimes we can look at, oh, World War One is started by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. We really have to step back and say, would there just be another event in that box that would have caused almost the same thing? Well, maybe not in the same way, because we'll see how the fall of dominoes really does emanate from Sarajevo and from that one bullet, from those bullets from that pistol. And here's how the dominoes fall. Austria-Hungary, after a series of sends a ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia, actually very weak, sees that it could be overrun by Austria-Hungary. Is actually somewhat conciliatory, but not completely conciliatory. Austria-Hungary, kind of eager to punish Serbia over the death of the heir to the throne, declares war on Serbia. Well, Russia moves to defend Serbia. So it's almost like some sort of game. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia moves to defend Serbia. So now you have um, Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Russia, Serbia. So right there, you can say that it's somewhat contained. If those were the only powers involved here, you could maybe see a quick end to this war. Well, that's not what's going to happen, because what happens might seem counterintuitive. Germany declares war on Russia because they have a mutual assistance alliance with Austria-Hungary. So immediately Germany declares war on Russia, but do they attack Russia? No, not immediately. They attack France. What? Because Russia has an alliance with France. And so they know that if they declare war on Russia, Russia will come in and attack them. But and then if France is allied with Russia, France will attack them here, and then they will be surrounded. So Germany declares war on Russia and then attacks France and declares war on France because they're activating the Schlieffen Plan. All of this happens in the space of days in early August 1914. England, knowing now, after Germany initiates the Schlieffen Plan and rumbles and sort of just roars right through the neutral lowland country of Belgium, the United Kingdom can't sit back and allow a neutral country really just across the English Channel from them to be taken over by Germany. They see this is a huge, not only affront to international diplomacy, but also it's just a huge threat to their own existence. The power of Germany increasing by that, just that fact of Belgium, and in fact, a lot of the war propaganda in the United Kingdom would be centered around defending Belgium, and not so much France, because remember, the UK and France are always warring. So a lot of it has to do with Belgium and innocent Belgium being overrun by Germany. In fact, a lot of the sort of sensationalistic propaganda about Germany, which we'll talk about, Germans sort of bayoneting babies and all sorts of things which are not really proved. All this atrocity propaganda, a lot of that is about Belgium because of their supposed helplessness. And Belgium does fall quite quickly. I mean, do not have a very advanced military, very strong military. So the United Kingdom comes in and immediately declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary. So now you have the main powers, right? The original Triple Entente is now all at war, and the Triple Alliance. But wait, what about Italy? Well, Italy's a special case, and we'll discuss. Italy's still wavering. They're still unsure because they have some incentive to get some of this area here in the Adriatic from Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary's loss could be their gain. So by 1915, they're actually going to join these powers. So there's two main blocks now. Now we switch from calling them Entente and Alliance, and we start to talking about powers. You have the Allied powers of Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan. Japan also fights on the side of the Allied powers, but I'm not going to get into too much about Japan today in relation to World War I. That's a story for another day. And Russia. And then the central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, later Turkey, sort of becomes that in the midst of the war, and Bulgaria. This is why it becomes kind of difficult to remember all these moving parts, because of the Ottoman Empire becomes Turkey, Italy switches sides, so it's not totally a linear process. So all of these dominoes fall, and now they're all at war. And here you have Europe in 1914. The war begins. Well, remember, it's a Schlieffen plan. If you get confused about the names, it's because Schlieffen's dead by World War One. It was just his plan. And the German leader of the forces, von Moltke, initiates the plan. Well, it's not exactly the Schlieffen plan, and this will come up after World War One, as all Germans will blame von Moltke for failing, and that some of his indecision contributed to the failure of this plan, especially because afterwards the Nazis will kind of take up a version of the Schlieffen Plan, but with better technology, and sort of orient all their industrial technology towards that sort of blitzkrieg march and attack on France, partially to avenge the defeat of the von Moltke version of the Schlieffen Plan. So von Moltke doesn't move as fast as he should, and there's some indecision in and also just practical considerations of how fast he can actually move. And so the Schlieffen Plan is initiated, but the Germans are actually stopped at about 35 miles outside Paris in August of 1914. All of this happens very fast, from basically August 1st into the middle of August, at the Battle of the Marne. British forces are able to stop the German advance, or at least halt it, and the Germans retreat back to the retreat. And in this retreat, the Germans now desire to, they get within 35 miles of Paris, but now the two sides, and I'm going to show you a map in a second, now the two sides are kind of at a stalemate at that one point. The Germans are going to try to go north and continually outflank the British and the French. So they're going to they'll go north, they'll try to outflank them, they'll be met by the British and French. They'll keep going north, they'll keep going north, they'll keep going north, all the way in what is called the Race to the Sea. And so all along this front, as these soldiers fight, and then the Germans try to outflank to the north and try to sweep around, and the British and the French stop them, you have this line, this long, hundreds of miles line, extending from essentially where originally the Battle of the Marne was fought, all the way to the North Sea. This is the line of trenches that is going to develop throughout Europe for the next 4 years, because it's going to be a stalemate along that entire front. And that is the front upon which hundreds of thousands, millions of soldiers are going to die. And the problem also is that perhaps von Moltke moved too slow. But in any case, Russia is able to mobilize their army a lot faster than Germany anticipated. Germany had anticipated something around 2 weeks for them to mobilize. And in fact, that's not what occurs. Russia is able to mobilize much more quickly. Germany is alarmed and moves many of their troops from that front, along that front wave of what was originally supposed to be the Schlieffen Plan, moves them back east to Russia, to the Eastern Front. So now Germany has what they have dreaded. Germany has a two-front war in Europe, and they can't push through, but they can't also give up. They can't give up that line. And so that's where the war is going to stop. The war stops along the Western Front. It essentially stops along the Eastern Front. And frozen in place along that line is just death occurs along that line for the next 4 years. Millions of deaths. Here is the Western Front, just to show you what I was talking about. Here's the Battle of the Marne, right outside Paris. British and French troops are able to defeat the Germans and drive them back to the Yasny River here. And then along this line is going to develop all of the trenches. And here is where the race to the sea happens. They will try to outflank. The Germans will try to go around. British and French will meet them. Germans will try to go around. British and French will meet them. Germans will try to go around. British and French will meet them. And this goes all the way up here, and along that line is where all the trenches first develop. And they eventually develop all the way down here as well. This becomes the Western Front in World War One. This is a description of the Battle of the Marne. You're free to pause it and look at it if you like. It's an interesting battle map, but I don't go too deep into battle maps. Here's the March to the Sea. Notice the dates and the particular battles in this. Excuse me, the Race to the Sea. March to the Sea is something different. This Race to the Sea, which takes place into October. So on the Eastern Front, Eastern Front's a little more dynamic. It's a little less trench oriented. You have German and Austro-Hungarian forces attack Russia along this front, but remember, the old saying, "Too many cooks spoil the broth." Well, it's kind of tough to coordinate with another power that has if you have a common border with one power, like Russia has this one border with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany and Austria-Hungary are going to find it kind of hard to cooperate here. In the end, about 3 million men die on the Eastern Front alone. The German and Austrian army commands, they don't really like one another. They are kind of rivals. I mean, they're cooperating in this battle, but each of them blames the other for any sort of misstep. And this creates a certain lack of cooperation between the two of them. Austria-Hungary will say, "No, we're going to push through," and Germany will go, "No, wait," and then vice versa. Another problem is that on this Eastern Front, you have another power which is a lot bigger in geographic size than in sort of military power. And the Russian command is very clumsy. It's also terribly top down and elitist. Remember, this is an autocratic nation ruled by a single man, ruled by the Tsar. And so all military decisions sort of devolve to this one individual. And this clumsy and elitist command is really not very good at waging the war, but they end up at least blunting this. And this line is going to be, notice here, farthest Russian advance. The Russians are going to advance as far as into here in 1914. But this is the sort of counter advance into 1915. I mean, this is 1914. This is 1915. So this line kind of goes back and forth to a certain extent, but becomes pretty entrenched itself. The dissatisfaction on the Eastern Front in all three of these powers, in Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, creates conditions ripe for mutiny in all three, and it sort of becomes a game of mutinous chicken, which is a really bad way of talking about it. Between each of the powers, none of them can really break through the other side, but each of them is perhaps hoping that the other side will implode from within. This will occur. This occurs in Russia in the October Revolution of 1917 and in the revolutions of 1917, as Russia collapses into revolution and eventually becomes the Soviet Union in the world's first communist, first socialist revolution. And again, we'll get into that in the next lesson. It's extremely important, but we'll leave that for now for the most part. So this Eastern Front, here's another map. This one's from your book. The Eastern Italian and Balkan fronts here. It looks complicated, but if you sort of draw a line down here, this is for the most part the Eastern Front line extends all the way into the Ottoman Empire, and Russia, I guess you could say, really loses this battle when it implodes in 1917. Its implosion is going to have really profound effects on the war, but again, we'll talk about that later. Remember, this is not a, again, this is a world war. It's a global war. It's not just taking place in Europe, um, taking place in China. China, which had been um, terribly weakened over the 19th century, um, and was really emerging from its imperial era. And you had these different European nations that had control um, of various trading zones in China. Well, after World War One breaks out, now you have these colonial powers fighting each other in these uh, colonial locations, and China became one of these locations. Um, there is a battle at the Siege of Tsingtao in 1914, where Japan and Great Britain fight Germany. You have German colonies in Africa, which are being fought over. These battles are typically nowhere near as bloody and sort of um, deadly as the wars in that are going to take place in Europe, but they are significant nonetheless. And you also have colonial soldiers that come from Africa, Caribbean, and India. So